confronting each other, laying out arguments, and then after that discussing what the merits of those are. We will have a two-part morning, and we will have a coffee break, believe it or not. I do also have an umbrella in case it rains, so we're safe. The first part will be about the radical shifts in the domestic European arena. Has radical change in European politics occurred or not? We'll look at election results, we'll look at the socio-economic dynamics, at the driving forces of the political winds. And then in the second part, after the coffee break, we'll look at the broader implications of these changes. Will there be radical change? So what do we expect in the near future? And secondly, what is the role of Europe in this changing world, rapidly changing world in every possible regard? So as I said, the goal is controversy. And we are part of a broader track within the European Forum Alpbach that's called Countering Polarization and Strengthening Social Cohesion. So there are other events along these lines. I will briefly present the speakers on the panel. You have their detailed, of course, biographies in the European Forum Alpbach app, and I urge you to look at them if you do not know the people who are here. And I'll start from my right. Petra Pinzler is a renowned journalist and author, award-winning journalist and author, works for Die Zeit in Germany. And if I translate correctly the title of her new book into English, Does This Have a Future or Can It Be Eliminated? Not bad, huh? Okay, thanks very much. Next to Petra is Vivian Ogu-Kobri. She is a researcher and founder of Puerta de Africa, the Door of Africa, member of the Forum Alpbach Committee, and a consultant on European-African relations, security, and international mobility, also award winner of Women of Europe of the European Movement. I will turn now to my left, Joschka Fischer, if I may, Joschka, from street fighting man to Minister and Vice Chancellor of Germany. You know all the rest. Next to Joschka and the three last speakers, and that's why I keep them together, are also, and I'm very proud to say, former Europe's Futures Fellows, a program that I lead at the Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna, but there are many more important things beyond that. So Peter Greco is from Budapest. He's the director of Political Capital and published a little book, very interesting, Trust Within Europe, and I'm sure we'll look at questions of trust in politics. Then over there to the far right physically, although he's sort of more to the left, is Alberto Alemano, who's a professor at HEC in Paris, the Hautes Études Commerciales, a professor of EU law, founder of The Good Lobby, a prolific writer and commentator on all things European. Those of you who follow him on X or X-Twitter know that he comments very much and very shrewdly on European affairs. And last but not least, my fellow Balkan, Ioannis Armakolas. He's a professor at the University of Macedonia in Greece and is also a senior research fellow at Eliamet, the most prominent Greek foreign policy think tank. So much for introductions, and I will now give what is called in this jargon of ours the impulse talk, which will be 5 minutes at most. And I also have to say that, as you know, our friend and colleague Ivan Krastev and our colleague and friend Janka Ortel were announced, but unfortunately, due to health circumstances, which fortunately are not serious, could not be with us today on this Sunday morning. So I'm stepping in for my namesake and friend Ivan Krastev to give this brief impulse. So here goes. Change happens all the time, and the title of this panel, Winds of Radical Change, maybe gives a little twist to the fact that we are living in changing times. We are in a period of war more than of peace, and the fact that the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine has upended what we saw, and I put this in big inverted commas, a period of peace in Europe, and I'll come back to that, and that we are confronted with challenges that we did not expect would happen after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I put this invasion at the level of epoch-changing moments such as the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then I come back to my personal experience. I come from a country, a European country that no longer exists. That country is Yugoslavia. I was born and bred there, lived a life in what was a sort of a version of liberal communism, an open country where Western influences were very strong. And we were supposed to be the first country to join the European Union after '89. We had relations with the EU since the 70s, etc., etc. And then as a social and political scientist, I had to learn the hardest lesson of all, and that is that evil can come back in history and in your life, even though we've all read the books, we've all visited the concentration camps, we've all seen the movies, and we've all talked to survivors of the Holocaust and of the partisan war. My father fought in Spain on the side of the Republic in the international brigades, and I was born and bred to be an anti-fascist. And to know that this came back in my own country as a social scientist, I didn't see it happening, I think was a very tough moment. I did not realize it was going to happen until the war started. This country called Yugoslavia that no longer exists is now 7 countries. So talk about change. That's quite radical, and that wind of change happened in the 90s. And I think the fact that in Europe, many Western political leaders said we've had a period of 70 years of peace is true only to a certain border of Europe, because before the Russian invasion, we had the Yugoslav wars, we had the invasion of Georgia, we had the war in Cyprus, and before that, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1968 of Czechoslovakia, and before that in 1956 in Hungary. So there was war and there was conflict in Europe west of the communist borders of Europe. So I think we have to be aware of that fact, and I think that informs some of what we will be seeing here, not to just be doom and gloom about the fact that, what are the next wars that we can expect? And of course, we'll touch upon Southeast Asia and Taiwan and China. The fact that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to President Clinton, is in China as we speak, are, of course, attempts to diffuse some of the tensions that have arisen, not to mention other parts of the world. So that's by way of the impulse, and we will now launch into the controversy. We have, as I said, 3 people who will be advocating or standing for the opinion that we have seen winds of radical change in European politics, looking at sort of the way that results have gone, and I won't steal any of their firepower by mentioning a variety of other things, and those who will say that basically things are plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. So I would like to ask Joschka Fischer to start us off. And we'll have 5 minutes each, so we'll keep this snappy and lively.
So, listening to you, I was pushed back in the past, and I don't like to talk a lot about the past, because all people coming to age are looking backwards. But in this case, I must make an exception. There was radical change on our continent. The radical change, you mentioned Yugoslavia. It was the first time that we were confronted with a revival of history on our continent. I will never forget the moment when I realized that Europe does not exist any longer based on the Yugoslav crisis. There was suddenly the confrontation of 1914. It was Vienna, Berlin, and Bonn against Paris and London. The EU didn't exist any longer. It was the confrontation of the run-up period of the First World War as a European effect of breaking up Yugoslavia, the Yugoslavian Civil War. And the brutality. Suddenly concentration camps were back in Bosnia. These pictures. And then the mass murder, the mass killing of Srebrenica. For me, this was a turning point because it demonstrated where we will end if we allow this violent nationalism, a revival of this violent nationalism. And then, 1989, the wall came down. It was a dramatic, radical change, more radical than anybody could imagine. But what was the consequence? It was quite clear that we have to integrate the Eastern European countries into the EU. Was that based on the impotence of the Europeans in the Balkans? Was that an awakening call? I experienced that as a foreign minister, and the Western Europeans all together thought business as usual. By the way, this is one of the reasons why the right-wing radicals came up. The far right in Europe was the only force who believed in radical change. And the center forces thought business as usual. And we see now where we are. My belief is that if we are not making up our mind that radical change will happen, it's not a question whether we like it or not. It will happen, and it will happen in Europe. Then we will be confronted with a radical change from outside, Putin and his war, and from inside, nationalist forces. And maybe one day a collapse of the European Union if the nationalists will get the upper hand. So it's not a question whether we like radical change or we want it. The question is whether we can adjust to radical change. And I think radical change means that the European Union must develop in the direction of to become a real power. Power politics is back. And if Europe wants to play its role to defend the interests and to defend our culture, then we have to become a force, including a military force. That's the radical change we are confronted with. And then we will see on the global level a completely different global order. We are.
Thank you, Joschka. We'll come back to the broader issues in the second part. I'd like her to stay fixed, rightly mentioning the developments that you had and what provoked the radicality of the radical right. But I'd like to come to you now, Petra.
Yeah, thank you so much. In fact, I should get double the time that Joschka had, because I would say that as much as I liked your introduction, it was a bit biased, I'd say. Huh? Because you also are on the side of radical change, and we have to defend the other side. which I'm going to try now. It's an honor to speak after Joschka, but I would like to kind of shift the way you look at the issue backwards or inwards. I would say radical change is a change that we experience in our lives. Have you experienced any radical change? Some of you, who has been here last year? Do you feel any radical change from last year to this year in your personal life? Yeah, you do? That's interesting. Maybe we should include the public, at least at one point.
The personal is political, Petra.
I know. I also would say and we have the second part where we talk about the future, my feelings towards reality are very different. My feelings when I look towards the future are very different. I have more fear than I used to have. But my daily life hasn't changed at all. I still have the right to speak, to say whatever I like to say. I still have the right to travel from northern Finland to southern Spain. I still have the same money. So in terms of the way I live my life, nothing radical has changed. Therefore, I would argue for most of the people, in terms of looking towards the world, things might have changed. But in the daily routine, there is no radical change now. At least not in mine and my family and in the circle of my friends, neither. And I'm living in Germany. Most of you will live in Austria. I don't talk about people living in Ukraine. I talk about Europe, and this is the topic, the EU. Yeah. The second argument that I would like to make is the institutional one. We all know that the populist right is rising in many European countries. I'm afraid of that and of the consequences. Yet they haven't been able to change the European institutions yet. We will have the same head of the Commission. Frau von der Leyen is back again. We have the same, more or less, the same middle course coalition in the European Parliament. And we have, in fact, still been able, or the moderate governments have still been able to kind of push Europe, keep Europe in the middle. This will change when we have a change after the elections in France. So what we will talk about the future in the second part, and then I will change sides. But so far, I would argue we haven't seen radical changes. And the last argument that I would like to make is about, just the question whether the way we look towards the world is the important one, or the fact, or the way we live. And the biggest argument and the most important one for this part of this session, and let's not think about the future, let's think about reality. Reality is what you have to measure in real lives, in real money, in real possibilities, in real changes, in real chances. And I would argue there hasn't been a big change yet.
Viviane, let me ask you, if I understand correctly, you live in Spain, yeah? Spain has been a bit of an outlier, if I can put it like that, because there is a socialist government. There was the rise of Vox, of course, but somehow the front has held. How do you see the reasons that Spain is not yet part of kind of this, at least danger in the present of a radical change in that way, given migration, given Catalonia, given all these other things?
I would say the reason are social policies. I think like the past government, like last, during the last period of government, there were put forward many social policies that mitigated the biggest shocks that we were going through all across Europe. For example, like regarding energy, how like Europe saw like real strong inflation, while Spain was like had like this exception that made people, yes, lose some of its economic capacity, but not in a really radical way. So I think that like this should be like one of the key reasons why this is happening. It's because I think that polarization mainly happens when people is going through really hard economic moments. So in Europe it started, well, in Europe and in the world it started mainly, yes, during the 2000s there was a little bit of polarization, but it started really during the 2008 after it. So people lose interest, like they lose trust in institutions. They are they are losing their economic capacity, and there is a party that does instrumentalize this and uses it, like identify some scapegoats. I would say that like a second reason why there has been a de-escalation is because in Spain we had a particular situation which was nationalism in Catalonia that actually fired all the country. It was like, I think was that the fuel for Vox in part. And the fact that there were these round of negotiations among the government and the independentist parties, and they were arriving to certain common positions and escalating. It was super interesting to see how like the communication was escalating like really slowly. This also, I think, stopped the far right a little bit, just like contain it. So it's still strong, and it's I think like the Vox still has like a lot of mediatic capacity, but and I would love to see what Alberto thinks about this. I think that like there has been some sort of an agreement among the democratic parties, because the Popular Party, despite having done agreements with the radical right in certain regions for government, there are certain topics that like they are confronting, and they are making like we call it in Spain sanitary cordon. So like there has been like sanitary cordons in small areas, and I think that like this has also helped like reducing like the shock, but it will arrive like for sure. Next elections we're having again like a right-wing party governing. The question is whether we can govern with this, like whether this right-wing party, the Popular Party, will govern alone, will govern with a new Ciudadanos, like a remake of Ciudadanos that died in these past elections, or it will be obliged to govern with Vox.
I'll then go to Alberto, because in Italy, where he hawks from, there has been a radical change in that the government of Meloni really has roots in fascism. In Mussolini's time, they have a tradition. They've, of course, cleaned up their image. They've distanced themselves from a certain number of things. And though internationally there is support for the broad Euro-Atlantic approach to Ukraine and everything, domestically there are worrying signs that there's an attempt to revert back. And I will quote our friend and colleague Nadia Urbinati, who's just written a book called Democrazia a fascista, basically all elected authoritarianism. So change or no change, Alberto? Or a gray zone?
Even change occurred in 1994 when Mr. Berlusconi decided to basically enter the political arena and opening what political scientists call the Overton window. All of a sudden, everything was possible, and in order to manage to govern in those years, he basically allowed the post-fascist party to actually run for the responsibility of the city of Rome by allowing Mr. Fini to run. That moment was a basic normalization of what we call today far-right messages in the political arena. And without that opening by Mr. Berlusconi, which actually occurred more than once, Ms. Meloni would have not been able to turn in less than 5 years a party which was scoring 6-7% into the leading party of my country of origin. So we need to go back there. Italy has always been, I would say, a laboratory of democratic or undemocratic or de-democratization in terms of experimentation. We have been doing this with the Nord League, trying a very early pioneering attempt at even splitting the country in twos back in the 90s, another ally of Mr. Berlusconi. So we need to go back there. Let's focus on Ms. Meloni today. Despite all the fear expressed in particular by international media much more than by Italian media, she basically managed to sell an image of continuity. Basically, her political economy is a copy-paste of the previous Draghi government, which is quite difficult to actually justify in ideological terms, but that's what happened, so full continuity. But at the same time, on the side, Ms. Meloni has been injecting major transformation of Italian society when it comes to reproductive rights, when it comes to pushing for a constitutional reform that would turn Italy into a presidential system nobody's talking about. Also limiting the ability of the media to cover what this government is doing. When you collect those elements, you clearly see that her strategy of, we can call it autocratization, or attempt at render Italy a less democratic country, is actually happening in a much subtler way that it might have happened in Hungary, or what it might have happened in Poland under Law and Justice. It is happening, is in society, and is really about normalizing messages, tones, which are clearly changing society in a way which is so difficult to gauge in the daily basis, but is really happening, is really shaping this kind of trend. Is Ms. Meloni a model for any other head of state or government in Europe? I think it is, and in the next 5 years we're going to see a lot of interesting alignment between the patriots, so-called patriots of Europe, so all these parties who are very antagonistic to the European project, and Meloni as being, yes, in a coalition government, she's not alone, so she has not unveiled her true face, neither at the national nor at the European level, but she's actually ready to jump and to basically leave, get out of the closet and show her true color. It's just a matter of months, perhaps days.
Wow, that's scary. Let me go now to the physically left flank and ask Peter. Orban was mentioned here, and the Patriot Group in the European Parliament that has been formed, and clearly what we have seen in the dynamic of European far right, and we saw that first with Le Pen, who wanted Frexit, France to exit. Then they realized how strong the support for European Union was in every single country of the European Union, notwithstanding the government that was there. And so they changed message and said, we want Europe, but we want to change it from the inside. Orban is clearly a leader in this direction, whether he's delusional or not. I'd like to ask you about that, but also about some of the socio-economic reasons you see for what you've written eloquently about tribalism, in other words, Peter.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And yeah, the status quo group seems to be a bit of underrepresented here in the panel, but I will argue for that in a narrow sense, and I think it's important to clarify what I'm going to talk about, because I think you both have rightly said that, yeah, there are tectonic changes in the security architecture of Europe. If we take a look at the Russia-Ukraine war, but if we just narrow our scope on European politics, for me it's very hard to see any dramatic, radical change. And I mean, there has been no radical change on the European Parliament elections, in Hungary neither, but this is less of a surprise given that Hungary is an increasingly authoritarian regime where the chance of radical change is rather limited. Still, Fidesz could perform the worst ever European parliamentary election results with 44% of the votes. It does not sound tragically low, I know, but still it's compared to that they have gained 54% 4 years ago, it's definitely a decline. Orban right now has a democratic challenger called Péter Magyar, who had 30% of the votes, and also I think to step on the European level, Orban's big hopes for the breakthrough of a unified far right have just not materialized. And first of all, the far right did not perform that horribly well as many expected. Yeah, if we add together the three far right groups, ECR, Patriots for Europe, and even more radical one around AfD, the ESN, the Europe of Sovereign Nations. They have about 26% of the votes in the European Parliament. It was the far right had about 20% votes in the last European parliamentary term. The previous one, I think it's not that dramatic change. Second, the far right is more divided on the European scene than ever before. AfD was practically expelled from Marine Le Pen's party because it was found too toxic, and they have their own group that have 0.0% influence on European decision-making. Patriots for Europe, that has 12% of the votes, and it's the third largest group in the European Parliament. Yeah, it's not irrelevant, I would not like to say. And Viktor Orbán was definitely instrumental in converting the previous ID group, Identity and Democracy group, led by Marine Le Pen, to this ID 2.0 group, and inviting some new players, such as Andrej Babiš, but still, they were practically excluded from when the commission seats or committee seats in the European Parliament were distributed. They were practically excluded by the mainstream parties, and they are treated as pariahs. So I don't think they will have a huge impact on European decision-making. And yeah, we have ECR. I think ECR has definitely more impact, both politically, I think both institutionally in the European Union. But there is one very important division line between ECR and the Patriots for Europe. So Marine Le Pen's group and Giorgia Meloni's group, and this is their relationship to Ukraine, which I regard as the #1 issue in Europe at the moment. So ECR is, and we at Political Capital Institute have analyzed the votes of the members of the European Parliament in the previous election when it comes to their votes on Russia and China. And what we found is that on the far left and on the far right, there are much more support by the members of the European Parliament towards Russia and China. And Patriots for Europe will clearly be a big supporter of mostly Russia and an opponent of Ukraine. But when it comes to European conservatives and reformists, and I think Meloni's role is important here, it's really mainstream when it comes to the pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian position of the European Union. So the far right is more fragmented than ever before. The far right won't be able to have a strong institutional influence on the European Union. The new head of the European Commission is Ursula von der Leyen, not a real revolutionary in my interpretation, and she was elected with 56% of the votes. In the previous term, she was just elected with 51% of the votes. So for me, all these indicate that the mainstream have remained pretty strong in Europe. And Orbán, in many sense, and we can just see it in his adventurism as leading the presidency of the European Council. So he's more a counter-indicator when it comes to European policies than, I think, the early bird of a new zeitgeist.
Thank you very much, Peter. Very helpful insights from inside Hungary itself. And somebody said Peter the Hungarian, Peter Magyar is challenging Orbán the Hungarian. Yanis, in Greece, Kyrios Mitsotakis is leading what from the outside looks as a moderate center-right government with obviously lots of domestic problems, not to go to the big train crash and everything that happened there. But also interestingly, on the front of the Balkans, Greece being the richest, strongest Balkan country that has a GDP that sort of resembles all of those countries put together, but has a spat with Albania on a certain issue, and the relations with Turkey always a central focal role in Greek politics. So how do you judge in terms of the theme of winds of radical change, question mark, the situation, and how do you see it both in Greece but also looking outwards from Greece towards the north of Europe after, of course, the very dramatic financial crisis that Greece went through?
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan. I will not focus on foreign policy for now.
No,
Maybe,
we'll leave that for afterwards.
Let's leave that for later. I think Greece is an interesting case because we have seen some trends that have, in a sense, shaped very much the political landscape in Greece, but also are indicative of potential trends in the rest of Europe. First of all, I think the panel implied radical change in a progressive direction, but I think we probably more or less all agree that there is radical change or creeping radical change or gradual radical change on the non-progressive side or regressive side of European politics. And going back to Greece, it's interesting that Greece was one of the first countries during the economic crisis that, together with Spain, but Greece primarily, tested a government that was a government of the radical left. You probably remember in the previous decade, 2015, Syriza came to power with an agenda to change everything, to change the economic dimension, to not recognize the debt, withdraw from the agreements, bailout agreements with the creditors, a radical change in the European politics. And I think the outcome of this experiment, which lasted for 5 years, is very interesting for European politics. So there you had the opportunity given to a radical left or radical progressive forces to shape domestic politics and maybe even influence international politics, and this experiment completely failed. And I think the reason that it failed is that they were really totally unprepared. They were not really understanding the amount of how big the challenge was. They thought that they were believing in their own words that we can change everything, we can change the economics, we can change society, but they were not realizing the enormity of the task. And this is very important for progressive politics. As Joska said earlier, the radical right is the only ones who believe in radical change, and they are preparing the radical change. If we see what's happening, yes, because of the Brussels bubble, the far right that will not have big influence in the European Parliament, in the positions, in the various committees. But of course, if you compare the strength of the far right in the European Parliament compared to 15 years ago at the start of the economic crisis, right now the combined far right in the European Parliament has the strength of the European People's Party. So this is very worrying, I would say, right? During the economic crisis, the progressive left, the radical left had its opportunity, especially in Greece they failed miserably, and the outcome of this was the collapse of the progressive pillar in the political system. It started before with the collapse of PASOK, the center-left party. That's why in political science we call it PASOKification, I think. This is the concern that all the center-left parties have in Europe, that they will not completely collapse from 40% to 4%. The outcome of an unprepared attempt at governing by a progressive government is that now we have a totally uncontested center-right with, I would say, very conservative leanings in government, a progressive opposition that is split in 3 or 4 parties, which altogether they do not make the percentage of the governing center-right party, and then 3 more parties to the right of the center-right governing party. So 3 parties of the far right in the Greek parliament, which altogether make about 20%. May not sound very big in other countries, but in Greece it's massive. Even during the high point of the economic crisis, you remember the Golden Dawn, the neo-Nazi party, they were not so strong. So Greece does not have a tradition of far-right parties in parliament because of dictatorship, etc. So and maybe I will close here. A lesson learned from for radical politics, progressive radical politics, is that if you want to try governing, you need to be prepared. You need to know what you're putting up with, and you need to be very realistic. Otherwise, the outcome is failure, which will bring regressive forces, whether moderate conservative forces or regressive far-right forces in power or influencing society for many years to come. And I think for many years to come, we will not see big change in Greek politics. We will have a conservative government which will always try to tend to the right, like the government in Greece now does, because they fear of the far-right element in parliament.
Thank you, Yanis. Thank you very much for reminding us of the radical shift that Syriza and Prime Minister Tsipras tried to bring about, but that failed, which shows, in fact, the huge interlinkages that countries have economically, socially, and in other ways, that it's very difficult to make a rupture in those relations. And of course, we all know a certain economist called Varoufakis who tried to lead that shift. I'd like to now go, because part of this initial part is also about looking at the driving forces behind some of these changes, and not to be too Marxist about it, to look at these socio-economic issues. Just a few days ago in the New York Times, there was a big interview with Senator Chris Murphy, who is looking for the past 2 years at neoliberalism as a driving force of what is the Trumpian movement, to speak in shorthand. And I urge you to read this article if you haven't. For many of us who've known that neoliberalism is not really helping the world, the power of corporations, the power of money in politics in the US in particular, but also the rising inequality for the past 4 decades at least, that has kept a median average salary in most Western countries, while the famous 1% has gone through the roof in terms of their earnings and profits. So I'd like to go back to Joschka to reflect on some of these issues.
Well, following the contributions here, I think we have to differentiate. Radical change, will it happening objectively? For example, for Germany, unification was a certain radical change, and we are still struggling with that fact. The unification of Eastern and Western Europe is a kind of radical change. I think in the analysis about the influence of the far right, it's the whole story is not told here. The whole story is the reaction of Macron in France, and in the follow-up of dismissing the parliament and new elections, I think the far right has a much better chance to get the LSA next time. It's not decided, but the possibility are there. And this would be a dramatic radical change, allow me to say that. So we have to differentiate. It's not about our everyday life, Petra. It's not about our everyday life. It's about the structure of the whole architecture. And when we look to America, what made Trump possible? What? It's the consequences of a neoliberal revolution in the economy, and the adventurism of the neocons during George W. Bush's legacy. I think the Iraq War played an important role in...
And you were a prominent critic.
Yeah, well, it's not about me. It's,
No, but...
It's that Trump's instincts are working very well. And in the election campaign against Hillary, he blamed her for this decision. Rightly so, because heartland America, the rural America, and the American working class were paying the price, not only in dollars, but also in blood. And therefore, I think we should be fully aware about the consequences of these structural changes. And in Europe, we are now confronted with an escalation of these changes. Putin has overthrown the European peace order we all believed in since the end of the Cold War. And now we are back in the old European days where power politics matters. This is a dramatic change, and we should be aware about that. So I think the big mistake the political center parties made is they thought we can go on. They were not able to adjust to these structural changes. And this offers the opportunity for the far right. From a German perspective, only the far right is challenging the status quo. Only the far right. The left disappeared, and the far right was moving into this empty space. And I'm not so optimistic about the European elections, by the way. I share the view of Yanis that the far right has made huge progress. And it's a certain form of irony that the far right, the nationalists, are fighting for the European Parliament. It's a contradictory in itself. And I don't believe that this will work. But this will block organic development of Europe. With a strong far right in the Parliament, this is a factor of blockade.
Well, they've clearly chosen their battleground in a different way than they thought they had about 10 years ago. They're going through, as you say, the European institutions now, or attempting.
Yeah, but there is also a positive. Allow me to add that. What was the reason for the split of AfD and Marine Le Pen? This was very interesting. It was when these terrible guy, Krah, mentioned that not all SS men were bad. This was impossible for a French nationalist to accept, and I guess also for Italian nationalists, because the memories about the atrocities the SS committed on the withdrawal at the end of the Second World War is still alive. So this demonstrated also that there are historical reasons for, against the unity of the far right. And Orban is he's not interested in European politics. He's only interested in European money and in domestic politics in Hungary to defend his position. Because who is Orban? Huh? Who? It's a joke. From a European perspective, it's a joke. And I don't believe that he will play an important role. I'm more concentrated, more focused on France. And today we will have elections in the eastern states, in yes. 3 eastern states in Germany, 2. And we will see the big winner will be Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, on the right and on the left. So this will have also dramatic consequences for the domestic development in my country.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you for bringing France up and Macron. Obviously, we're all riveted on the developments there. And I was listening to a program on French cultural radio where there's this concept of a political scientist used called extreme centrism, which of course is an oxymoron, but tried to describe Macron's attempts to keep the center to hold, but we see how tenuous that has been. But Petra, coming back to you, could you reflect on some of these other issues that have driven, and maybe give your sense about these upcoming elections today in the Länder?
So you want me to look in towards the future already?
Just for tomorrow, not beyond that.
Let me just agree at one point with Joschka. I absolutely agree that the architecture of institutions is in danger, and I absolutely agree the social forces are not something that should make us lean back. So the futures I look towards are rather dull. Nevertheless, I have a lot of problems with overusing the word radical, and I have to make this point once again. You probably know this old Greek story of the boy and the sheep and the wolf. I think was it Herodot? The ones among you who don't know it, it's a very short story. It goes so: there's a shepherd, a young boy who goes towards the mountains with the sheep, and he's just bored. So he cries, "The wolf! The wolf! The wolf is coming!" And all the people from the village come up the mountain to help him to protect the sheep. But there's no wolf. He does this once again, and the villagers come up the hills once again, and he does it the third time, and nobody shows up any longer. But at that third time, the wolf is there. So when we, and I work for a newspaper, so we are always tempted to overstate headlines. Yes. To make everything more dangerous than it actually is in reality, because we're clickbaiting. At least many of us have to do this to get you as readers. I would argue, be careful. We should be careful, because the situation we are in is rather the one of the frog who is being boiled. I never tried it because it's animal cruelty, but there is this other story that when you put a frog into cold water, and then you boil it slowly, you heat it, he'll die and not actually realize that he's dead. So I never tried it, I don't know whether it's true, but I would actually argue this might be the situation we are in. We have not a radical switch from one side, from white to black, but we have slow changes in lots of areas, and this is what makes me afraid. We have the far right gaining in parts of Germany in the east, which will be a shift within European and within German politics. Maybe they become the biggest party in parts of Germany. We have the same situation probably in the French elections, which will then change the dynamics within Europe a lot. We have countries, even though Hungary might be a joke, and not being the model. Italy definitely is, because most of the Europeans, we don't see it the way actually it is happening within Italy. Because Meloni, regarding European politics, is pretty moderate. So we just don't look into what's actually happening within Italy. So the danger is that the new reality becomes reality without us even noticing. And one final point, one, as you said, what's the underlying currents? One of the biggest shortcomings of the mainstream politicians, I would say, is that they didn't really have an answer to the growing social inequality. And I don't just mean the economic and the material inequality, but also the feeling of people of being left alone. People on the countryside, as we saw it in the US, you have kind of the same feeling in the eastern part of Germany. And it's not just about money, it's about belonging. Apparently there's a lack of belonging towards the states we are living in, towards democracy. And the moderates and the left, they haven't been able to have an answer towards this problem. The feeling of we need to change something, we need to better our countries, we need a shift is rather on the right than on the left in the mainstream. And in politics, Joschka, you might correct me, but feeling is an important issue, isn't it? Yeah.
Do you think that today, if Kohl and Mitterrand were back, which is not possible, but just for the sake of the argument, with the strong far right, that the European currency could be founded again? I don't believe that. This would be a huge campaign, stealing our money, whatever, in all these national varieties. It would be impossible.
I absolutely agree. Nevertheless, I would say this feeling of we need to change something, we need to better our country is something that the moderates and the progressives are not able to kind of formulate as a message toward the people. This is our project. Democracy is our project that we need to save. I don't see any of this. Do you? They don't find the words any longer to speak to the people. Otherwise, they wouldn't lose one election after the next.
Let me go to Viviane on this question of democracy, because this is really one of the issues in the feeling of whether it's real or perceived of radical change, but people do feel disempowered. They do feel disgruntled about all sorts of issues that Petra just touched upon. How do you see this? And then I'll go to the others on this same question.
So I want to make a couple of points. First, answering your question, and then I wanted to add to what you were saying. I can speak, I think, regarding my generation, because my generation, I think, is completely out of politics. Not completely. There are a bunch of nerds that we are super focused on it and just meeting each other all the time and doing everything we can to promote voting for the European elections, for instance. But it's true that right now we are disengaged because the political communication that has been useful the last decades, it was for a world where information came from the news, right? And now for us, the main information channels are social media, Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok. I think that we are also maybe we are this generation that has a lot of ADHD, right? Because of all the stimuli. We are overstimulated, that's true. And I think that that makes that we do not engage with the way then older politicians engage maybe with the society, broad society. And also we are a generation, we are one of the poorest generations up to date. We cannot emancipate. We are not having proper salaries. So there are a lot of structural questions that are preventing us into engaging into democracy. My question here, and I think it's because we are discussing whether there radical change has occurred or not, and I feel that after elections, it's normal that we feel that radical change happened, because elections is exactly the moment when communication machinery is 100% functioning. But they are elections are just the are just the moment of truth and not the moment of change. So you see the things that have changed across several years, but they do not change at that specific moment. And I would make an example, for example, with the housing crisis. I think that we're starting to listen a lot about the housing crisis. That was a big topic, at least in Spain, and it's being a big topic in, for example, Catalan elections and also during the European elections. But actually, we've seen that since 2010, around our housing has increased on 50%, more or less. But like now we have the shocks, like there are the 2008 crisis, like then we have like the COVID crisis, we have Ukraine, we have like disinflation. All these was adding up, and it was only when the big elections came that all these topics were super featured. So that's why I think that like there is no radical change in this year, but just like more a structural question.
Alberto, quickly, because I'd like to open the floor for a few questions as well.
Thank you, Ivan. I think it's very important to highlight a bit of a paradox that is emerging out of our conversation. To make sense of the outcome of the European elections, we need to start talking about the French elections, about the German elections, about Italians' Meloni's, about what has been happening in Greece, what has been happening differently perhaps in Spain. This shows something that we have normalized, the fact that the European Union, after 70 years of socioeconomic integration, doesn't have a European political space in which your choice in the European election as an individual citizen is reflected in the political color of the next European political priorities. And the fact that this is not happening after 70 years is deeply problematic. Is what is really holding us back from making any progress, in particular when transforming Europe from a community of values into a community of power, a community of geography, and something that I guess in the second part most of us are going to be arguing, that is just a matter of urgency, it's not a matter of choice. So unless we're going to be Europeanizing our political conversation and we're going to make it intelligible for the average citizen, the ordinary citizen, why this matters, we're not going to be able to have the democratic legitimacy needed to make such a quantum leap that has to occur, because if it doesn't occur, we're going to lose relevance. The relevance is already lost in terms of demographics. By 2050, probably going to be around 5-6% of the population. When I was born, we were closer to 15, so just a matter of time. I'm not that old, but still is half a century, and this is just impossible to stop. So the democratic legitimation of all what we do in Europe is becoming even more important than 20 years ago, when we try with the constitutional treaty, when we try to somehow fill that particular gap. We keep cutting the corners. All of the transformation that have occurred over the last 5 years, Next Generation EU, so forth and so on, what we're doing in the European Peace Facility, are all decisions that have been taken basically without democratic accountability. The European Parliament was not even heard. We have been using legal bases like Article 122, which was basically nobody knew about it, in order to just provide answers which technocratically are great and probably needed and justifiable, but vis-a-vis the public, they cannot continue forever. So history is back with a vengeance. Unless the EU will fix its democratic sin, we're not going to be able to go further. So I'm extremely worried about this, because there's so much complacency among European political leaders. They are all elected at the national level. Why they should be held accountable vis-a-vis citizens living beyond their borders? Unless we are going to be Europeanizing the political party competition by allowing somebody who is voting CDU to understand that he's actually also voting Forza Italia, he's also voting PIS in Poland, or in the past Fidesz, nobody will understand what's going on. So to me, this is the urgency.
Same for Ioannis and first, and then Peter.
Yeah. Thanks, Ivan. I want to pick up from what Joska said and Petra. Because the danger of the far right, I think it's important to recognize it in its true measure. I mean, it's important not to overestimate the danger, but also important not to underestimate. And Joska mentioned something that is always reassuring, not only the publics, but also politicians, that there are historical divisions that will divide now, divided in the past, divide now, will continue to divide the far right in Europe, right? But I think there is a risk here that we became complacent and we are boiling the frog, or they are boiling the frog for us gradually. And I would argue that, yes, historical divisions are there. If you ask the younger members who vote for the far right or go to these demonstrations or whatever, I don't even think they know all these historical events really. I mean, they know only the rhetorics and maybe some buzzwords. I don't think they have read the history. I don't think they understand these historical divisions. But what will be the glue I fear that will bring all these far-right groups together in the future, increasingly will be the culture wars, which is, I think, a problem that we haven't recognized enough in Europe. We see how much divisive this issue has become and polarizing in the US. It has traveled the pond, it's now in the UK, and it's transforming the Tory party, which was never far-right. The Tory party was always a mainstream conservative party in Europe. Now they have been attracted, I think, increasingly to the far-right because of the influence of the US and these trends. And I think we will see more of that coming in the EU unless we pay attention to this. So will the glue, the culture wars do away with the historical divisions? Probably not, but I think it's instructive to follow the debates in the far-right, the fringe far-right groups. For example, if you go to websites of the far-right, if you see the magazines, etc., how do they communicate? How do they interact, and the ideas and the influences travel if they fought these big wars back in the Second World War, etc.? But they still, the far-right groups communicate, exchange information, cooperate, etc. I think these historical divisions are there, but we shouldn't overestimate this and we shouldn't rely on this. We shouldn't expect that the far-right divisions will do the actual pro-democracy or defense of democracy work that we should be doing. It's very important. The US influence, especially if Trump wins the elections, if Trump fails and then maybe we see a transformation in the Republican Party in the US, maybe this will be a positive change. But if Trump wins, I think we will see so much investment from the other side of the Atlantic to ideological, cultural transformation in Europe that it will be very difficult to beat. And the vigilance should be our recipe, and we should do the work, not expect that the far right will fight each other. I'm reminding of something that Ivan said earlier about evil that can come back. Very briefly, an example from former Yugoslavia. It was always mentioned by a late friend of mine who was a journalist, a Greek journalist, during Milosevic's times in Yugoslavia. And he said there were people like intellectuals, scholars in Yugoslavia, long tradition of anti-fascism, right, who spent their entire lives studying fascism and talking about fascism. And when fascism in the 1990s or even the 80s knocked on their door, they didn't recognize the phenomenon, right? And very few resisted. Ivan was one of them. But very few people resisted, including people who spent their entire lives, their entire careers, talking about the fight against fascism in the Second World War. When it came to their home, they didn't recognize it. So we need to be vigilant, and we need to recognize these trends in the European societies because they're coming, and it's not going to be the divisions of the far-right groups that will do the work for us. We will have to defend democracy.
Peter, briefly, and then one question before the coffee break.
Okay, I will be really brief, and I think it does not put you automatically in a winning rhetorical position if you counter-argue to Joschka Fischer, but I have to counter-argue at one specific point. I totally agree with you on that. Viktor Orban is not as important on the European level than many things, and I think journalists usually play a huge role in overblowing his importance on the European level. But I disagree with that. The 26% representation of the far right in the current European Parliament, which we can regard as high, and of course, if we compare it to the representation, let's say 20 years ago, it's undeniably higher. But I don't think they can really be a blocking minority in the European Parliament. There is a threat, though, of course, that if elections in Austria, in the Czech Republic, and in some other countries will result in more far-right governments on power, that there might be a blocking minority in the European Council. And that's, I think, Viktor Orban's real goal. He could not really achieve it even with Slovakia so far. So he had high hopes for it. And Italy, he had high hopes that when Italy will elect a far-right government and Slovakia will elect a national government, then they will just change the rule of the game in the European Council. They didn't. And I think if we roll a bit back in And I would just connect to Manuel Barroso's verse yesterday. I mean, if we take a look at the last, let's say, 20 years or even less of European politics, there has been many doomsday scenarios, and doomsday scenarios always sell well because they are always more interesting than just saying that things will more or less remain the same. Around the Greek crisis, yeah, the European Union will fall apart and the Eurozone will fall apart. Then there were many doomsday scenarios about the migration crisis, that, yeah, it will just totally break the European Union. It didn't. There were doomsday scenarios about the Brexit, that it will lead to the total disintegration of the European Union. It didn't. There were doomsday scenarios about the corona crisis, that it will just break the unity of the European Union. I don't think it did. And finally, about the Russian invasion, that it will just totally undermine the European Union because the division between the hawks and the doves are so deep that it cannot be overcome. And it didn't, finally. I think Europe, yeah, and I would not, just to make it clear, I do not say that these crises did not have an impact on the European Union, but I think the European institutional system, which is complicated, which is in some cases seems a bit of inefficient, which is a complicated animal. It's hard to explain, for example, to an American what the European institutional system is about. But I think this complexity is also a buffer to radical changes, and it gives it to a certain stability, I think, in rather a good sense. And as a last thought, I would just, I think it's a very interesting question that Ivan, you raised about the role of the economy. I'm a social psychologist and not an economist, but in the political science literature, there are much more research that supports the claim that the rise of the far right is more of an identity thing. It's more of a cultural thing. It's more of a psychological thing than a material thing. And I think so there has been many cases when the economic problems did not result of the rise of the far right. If the far right were only an economical thing and it was about inequality, we could have observed a huge rise of the far right until the 2008-2009 crisis, and we couldn't. So I think that cultural wars are simply more important, and at this point I would totally agree with almost all the speakers who raised this point, and Joschka Fischer first, that yes, right now the far right is the real revolutionary force, and they paint themselves as the revolutionary force. And they can very persuasively argue that they are the new force of freedom, because the Greens want to tell you, for example, how much hot water you should use, if you should eat meat or not. The governments want to tell you if you should stay at home at the corona crisis or vaccinate yourself. And I think this narrative of freedom that is increasingly captured by the far right is a grave danger. And at this point, I would be alarmist as well, that if there is no good political response to that, then it could lead to a further rise of the far right.
Thank you very much. I'll use the prerogative of the chair to declare the end of the first session and have a coffee break right now, and then leave more time for questions in the second part. I came here by train yesterday and went through Italy and went to a bookshop, and I was surprised by the number of books on fascism. I'll just give you two titles. One was by Professor Luciano Canfora that said fascism is not dead. And the other one was about the fact that Italy had not done enough reckoning with the fascist past. And of course, that's a huge topic that we have all looked at, that we're looking in my country and in the region. That raises a question, have we dealt with the past or not? But we'll leave those big questions for a cup of coffee and standing outside in the fresh air. And I would like to ask you to come back in 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
May I just add something? You should come back, because you ought to come back. Not just because we are just great here and we are slowly waking up, at least I'm slowly waking up. But in the beginning, there was mentioned that I just did the research and wrote a book, which, by the way, will be presented tonight. This is Just a short remark. What I learned while writing this book is that we all lost the competence of looking towards the future. The UNESCO calls this future literacy, and it's really important. If you want to learn more about it, come back to the second part of the session. Okay. Have a good coffee break.
Well, welcome back to the second part of our Winds of Radical Change in European Politics. I'd put a question mark on that at the end, because we're discussing whether there has been and will be radical change. And for those of you who were here at 9 o'clock this morning, this second part looks at the broader context. And we look into the future, and Petra appropriately talked about future studies and future outlook. There is a social science called futurology that's existed for a long time. I think Johan Galtung in Sweden was someone who looked into those things. Anyway, so we're looking at will there be change? And secondly, we're looking at Europe's role in the broader world context. In shorthand, we sometimes use this phrase that it's a G2 world, a world where the United States and China have the overbearing role and presence. We do live in geostrategic and geopolitical times, and Joschka emphasized that, and I think we would all agree that transactionalism and the role of great powers is back, that of course the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine upended the European security order that was created in Helsinki back in 1975, for those who remember that year and those memorable events that allowed many things to happen, among others the dissident movements in the communist countries. But then also this question of Europe as a power. The outgoing High Representative for Foreign Policy has talked about the need for Europe to again become a power. Joschka again talked about it. I would agree to it, because there are two things that the Russian invasion basically made very clear. One was that the dependence of Europe, and in particular Germany, on Russian gas was a non-starter, that the use of trade to achieve peace was not actually working, that those of us who had studied Montesquieu and knew his famous phrase about les douze effets du commerce, the sweet effects of commerce, are not always true. And thus the radical decoupling from dependence on Russian gas, which is not true for this country, Austria, which still imports all of its gas from Russia, but that's a whole other theme. And then the second one is the American security umbrella that Europe lived under since World War II and allowed Europe to develop in the ways that it did to strengthen the European Union, but not without needing to bolster its defense and military capacities. All that has changed. Of course, Zeitenwende came along in Germany, but all others are understanding. So we'll talk about all of these things, and we have to my right the status quo. Again, this is for the purpose of debate, but obviously everyone will say what they think. And then we have the to my left, those who will purport that we do need radical. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. I got my left and right hand wrong. So here we have the radical change, pardon here, and here we have the status quo people that things basically are chugging along more or less as they are, and that we won't need to make radical change. So I will then start with the radical change, and I'll start with Alberto this time.
Thank you, Ivan. Yeah, let me start by saying that change has already happened, is already occurring in front of our eyes, but is a pretty silent change. It's a set of transformations the European Union and its leaders had to accept because the world forced the European Union to actually react to major external pressures that were not necessarily expected, but those ranging from a natural disaster, if we can qualify that way, such as COVID, all the way to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have certainly put the European leaders in front of new scenarios that were, in a way, forcing them to do the following, to repurpose, to retool the very same tools that our founding fathers, there were not many mothers around in those days, or they were, but they were not named, were initially introduced. Trade is no longer something that is used by the EU to somehow conquer market shares, but is something that is used to exercise a soft hard power effect. We are thinking about major transformations in the way in which we have been adopting laws and regulations. You know, we are basically protecting the exports we make. We are filtering the imports we get. We are trying to develop industrial policies, something that has been really an anathema in the European integration process. In other words, we are repurposing, we are retooling those tools. We are doing it within the treaty, sometimes outside of the treaty, meaning with or with limited control, but these transformations are happening. Once again, the European citizens are marginalized, are sidelined from those processes, but this is happening now. And there's no way, regardless of the outcome of the US elections, which might actually be more relevant for the future of Europe than the outcome of the European Parliament elections of last June, that this transformation will be blocked. In other words, the world is going to change regardless of whether the EU will have or not the ability to react. There are positive signs. There are half of reforms started. The European Union has been trying to do something on chips, has been trying to do something on raw materials, has been trying to mimicking and somehow chasing both the model of the US, which is a very Biden outgoing administration, extremely nationalistic in that sense, in full continuity with Trump when it comes to economic matters, but also China. So there is this momentum very much crystallized by Ursula von der Leyen political priorities presented in July, when she basically said, this is the new power game in which we're going to be entered. Will she be able to pursue such a vision? Will all the European member states, governed by so many different personalities with so many different visions of Europe which are emerging now, allow her to actually embrace the transformation from a community of values, a community of democracy, dignity, all the values we like to preach to the world, to a community based on power, on geography, on rules that in reality give us reflection of power, as opposed to simply a projection of a community values. Will she be able to do so, or the Orban of the world, the Meloni of the world, the incoming right-wing party or government potentially likely, I guess, partly in Austria, perhaps in the Netherlands, in Belgium, we will see, allow that vision to occur, or there won't be one vision for that kind of Europe. In other words, will this new future of radical change unite these European leaders, or we create yet another split and therefore delay our ability to embrace this radical shift that is imposed on us from external pressures?
Joschka, you've written a book with the title The Decline of the West. How does that square with the situation where Europe needs to now squeeze a role for itself in between these two great powers?
Well, I think the major political question is, what will happen to us? What will happen to the Europeans? Because I think America will, with all the hiccups, make it. They will not resign from being a world power, and China will make it too. And if things are going well, we are going into a G2 world based on cooperation, because it makes no sense if the two superpowers of the 21st century will confront each other. About what? We have new challenges. We have challenges for mankind, climate change, all these issues needs a close cooperation, and a confrontation between the two superpowers would be senseless. Therefore, I would be in favor of a G2 world. We see dramatic technological changes. The world in 50 years will not the world we know, whether we like it or not. So what will be the role of Europe? What will happen to us if the status quo will continue? I think we will face decline. If you want to have a picture how this decline might work, look to Argentina. Argentina in 1945 was one of the wealthiest countries, and with a strong middle class. And now? So we see a change of the world order. The American world order is challenged. What we see is several major global powers will be in a situation of rivalry on the global stage. If Europe will not be a power, we will be doomed. So my optimism is based on not what the different leaders think, ideologically, but what will happen. I think the most important leader of Europe is outside of Europe, Vladimir Putin, and the American president, the Chinese president. We will have to adjust to that, to these decisions, and we need the instruments for this adjustment. Otherwise, I think Europe will be doomed. And I'm too old to have personal concerns. But with 4 grandchildren, you are thinking about the future. Life goes on without you.
Absolutely.
That's for sure. And Europe in the decline would be a nightmare perspective for me. Therefore, Europe has to adjust. I warn you, don't start institutional reform debates. This will end in the nowhere. I tried it several times. It's a no-go. You have to change Europe, you have to accept Europe as it is. For example, a question. We made promises to Ukraine, very important promises. But the Europe of the present time, can we finance that? Can we look only on the agricultural market? The uproar in Poland, what that meant. Can we finance that? And can we do that, that Ukraine will be a member of the European Union? My answer is, in the present situation, no. The Europe of tomorrow has strategic interests which cannot be covered by the promise of full membership. They are far more reaching regionally and geographically. So we need a new approach. This is only one element. What will happen with the Balkans? Yugoslavia created how many states?
7.
7. It's in the institutional framework of today. It would mean 7 commissioners. It would mean more commissioners for Yugoslavia than for France and Germany, the biggest countries. Impossible.
Okay, that's a very important theme of enlargement, which I would like to come back to.
Yeah, but I mean, in our relationship to Turkey, it's also pending. There are so many questions. which had to be addressed, but not with, the answer cannot be an institutional change. It must be done in the present situation.
Absolutely, and in fact, it's so important that you bring in Turkey, because Turkey, although completely different, is of a magnitude of issue as Ukraine is. What happens when the EU brings in such a big, numerous country? Ukraine, you rightly mentioned agriculture. Turkey is an economic powerhouse, but let's come back to that. I'd like to go to Viviane now.
If I may, Ivan.
Yeah, sure.
Just to push a little bit, Joska, on this point, because there's a bit of a tension in what you're saying. On the one hand, you say, we shouldn't reopen the treaties, the rules of the game, because it's a no-go, right? The member states are not ready, citizens are not interested. You tried 20 years ago, didn't go well, right? But at the same time, you're also saying we are not ready to accommodate countries that have been waiting in line, like the Western Balkans, for long. So something has to be rethought when it comes to the rules of accession, of what does it mean to be a member of the European Union. So something has to be reset in the rules.
Well, I would, after many thoughts, I came to the conclusion we should accept the EU as it is, the membership as it is, including Orban, unfortunately. And accession does not mean a direct way to full membership. We have strategic interests, and we must put our strategic interests in the forefront. We have to deal with Ukraine, we have to deal with Turkey, we have to deal with the Western Balkans. All these issues are in our interest. And we have to become a military power based on the contribution of the national states. Let me be frank about that. Absolutely. So this means to transform the EU in an EU of defense.
Good.
That's my view.
Good. Viviane, let me go back with that question to you, because Spain obviously is on the far western side of the Union. How is this need for Europe to become, in Joska's words, a Europe of defense seen over there? And I'd like to throw in a new important dimension, and that's the demographic dimension of a declining demography in Europe. Europe will be, what, 4% of the world population in about 20 years' time.
I will answer about migration, but I want to continue a little bit with this because I think it's important. You started asking yourself, like, what's going to happen with Europe? And I also ask myself the same. And I think that, like, particularly because you cannot defend yourself from something you don't want to understand. And I think, like, we are so self-centered as Europeans that we don't really understand, like, what is going on in Africa, for example, how Africa is using the emerging power, well, the power of China and other emerging powers, just like to bargain us and to transform. Like, they even achieved to transform like the DG IMPA, right? So, like, we changed the way we approach relations with Global South because there are so much willingness for global change, and they are pushing hard. And we are still asking ourselves, like, how, like, what's Europe, like, what's the role of Europe? And we look at it, like, from a really selfish perspective. And I think that, like, this is really dangerous. I think that right now the Global South and the emerging powers, the BRICS, what won is a world change. And it is because, like, power has been on our hands for so long. Wealth distribution has never existed to those countries. So, like, literally, Africa still provides us with critical materials we need for being such a great living space. And they are facing with the worst economic situations ever. They don't want that. And they are gonna do anything they can do for at least balancing power, and who knows, maybe trying to lead the world someday. And I think that this is what we should start to try to understand. We need to try to understand what the Global South wants, and what are they doing for it. Coming back to the migration question, and particularly for Spain, yes, I'm saying like there are radical, like there is a radical change. I'm not sure, depending on how you say it. It's true that like this like the growing demographics, but particularly I think that like the fact that we have like more work than our citizens are actually taking, like in Spain, like we have shortage of workers everywhere, and it's gonna be like 60.2 millions in 2060. So like we're gonna have like a really big shortage. It's true that like by natural economics, like people move to where there is work. So like that's why we're having like all these like migration flows. And the question I always ask myself is, if we know that we're gonna need to integrate them into our labor market, what are we waiting for? Why are we not giving visas to make easy their path so they can actually adapt and acculturate a little bit to us, and we can shape the way? And otherwise, like we are building walls so to open the small doors. And I don't know. But the thing is that like really big change is coming. China is leading, yes. And what is being confronted, I don't think is like in terms of territory as it was before, for example. So I think we need an army because that's how the world works. But like what China wants is to decide on how we make the laws and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and what cosmology will imperate in the world. That's what we've been imposing over the rest of the world for centuries. And I think that the rest of the world just want that their vision of how things should work imperate. And I think that like that's the big change that unfortunately at some spaces I think is coming. Unfortunately, because there are certain areas in which I might not agree personally. But I think that also it is an opportunity for qualitative change, because if we achieve, like in this process, we achieve certain balance, if we achieve like to reduce poverty, if we achieve that like all these people can actually bring in their thoughts, impressive innovation might happen from all these new ideas just like coming together. So yeah.
No, and thank you very much for bringing in lots of issues, Africa in particular, but our societies would not function without all the migrants who are already here. I mean, I talked to a few drivers of the buses that take us from Fergal. One was Greek, one was Czech, so we wouldn't be able to get up here to Alpa without those people who are coming. In Belgrade, bus drivers are now from Nepal and Sri Lanka. On the Croatian coast, you have people in the kitchens who are not anymore from Europe at all. So this huge paradox that we have where anti-migration, I mean, driving the whole far right scare of the grand replacement, and on the other hand, the dire need for, as we say in every country, for both doctors but also bus drivers. But let me turn to Yanis on this issue of enlargement from the aspect of the geostrategic strengthening of Europe. Because if you leave the space open, you have the spoilers of Russia and China in their different ways, and I completely agree on their different ways. China has a very long-term strategy, and they're taking piece by piece. How do you see this issue in the need for Europe to stop navel gazing, but look out into the world and see these huge changes that are happening?
Europe, the EU is already very, very late in including integrating the Western Balkans. There was a time when there was, for the Western Balkans, the only game in town was the EU. The EU thought, well, we can wait indefinitely, maybe we want them, maybe not, and then they have no other choice. They will always wait for us to decide whether we want them or not. This game is over because, yes, there is no alternative like the EU for the region, but there are increasingly other alternatives that do not look like the EU, like a big formal structure like the EU, but there are alternatives like authoritarian liberalism or influences from China or Russia or other countries, Turkey, you name it. So in the 10 years when the EU has frustrated the hopes of the Western Balkans for integrating in Europe, the actors, the non-EU actors, the non-European actors have multiplied in the region. It's unbelievable that now we are talking about China, Turkey, Russia, UAE, Iran, Saudi Arabia, you name it, Qatar, a number of actors. And there are models. And in the last few years, we had two models in the Western Balkans on how you respond to this reluctance, destructive reluctance on the part of the EU. The one model was the Zaev model. We do everything. We go even against our own public opinion. Zaev being
Explain who Zaev is.
Zaev was the Prime Minister of North Macedonia, who managed to completely destroy his political capital by doing what the EU was asking him to do. At least in foreign policy. I should say that in domestic politics, some things did not work very well because of corruption and various issues. And this was the most hopeful example for the region because it was democratic, because it was supported by grassroots mobilization, because it brought down an illiberal or semi-liberal regime of Nikola Gruevski, and they did what the EU told them to do, and they completely failed because the EU did not keep its promise. The other model, which is the successful model up until now, and it's the model that will be replicated by others if the EU does not act more responsibly and more strategically, is the Vučić model. The Vučić model says, yes, we pretend that we want to join the EU, but in fact, we will do business with everybody. We will promote a liberal state. We have Orban supporting us. Right? Orban is the best friend of Vučić, is the best friend of all illiberals in the region, and he's pro-enlargement because he wants more illiberal states in the EU. And Vučić is alive and kicking, whereas Zaev is retired, right? And lost the elections, or his party lost the elections, and they will be in opposition for many years. So this is the type of regimes, the type of models, including foreign policy models that the EU is producing because of its inaction, because of its reluctance to accept the reality that the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe are part of Europe, and they will become part of the EU. I mean, we like it or not, Joska. I mean, I know there is more willingness on the part of the political elites to integrate these countries than the public opinion in certain countries, in Germany, in Austria, in other places. But listen, I mean, the reality is that we have to do it. I mean, the same way that even if the publics are maybe reluctant to see at the European level confident moves in developing defense capabilities, but we have to do it because this is the imperative. If we don't do it, it will happen what Alberto said. The outside in will press us, they will decide for us. So we have to do it. Okay.
The paradox is that in waiting to join countries to become members of the EU and the impatience of people are joining individually by going to Germany, to Austria to find work. And of course, what I call the vacuum cleaner of Germany. Germany has just allowed even more liberal ways for people from Serbia to spend a year finding jobs because of this dire necessity for things. So we have an imbalance of responsibility there, for example.
Sorry, just one minute. It's very irresponsible on the part of EU member states. They are removing crucial talent, crucial professionals from the Western Balkans. They do not keep the promises about integrating the Western Balkans in the European Union, but at the same time, they get the best talent. They get the most educated people. So Serbian taxpayers, sorry, Joska, Serbian taxpayers or Albanian taxpayers pay thousands of euros to educate doctors and all sorts of professionals, and they are ready with their degrees, and they go to Germany. It's a reality.
Yeah.
And Austria and other places, in Greece and whatever.
Why is that so? Because the traditional EU is not ready for institutional change. And we cannot accept 6 new member states in the existing institutional framework and in the existing financial agreements. It's impossible. And it will be impossible with Ukraine.
Two sentences. It may be true, like Alberto said, maybe we need to discuss how to change the rules, but also at the same time, we should not forget that the same arguments were made before the Big Bang enlargement, that they will destroy decision-making process, that the EU will collapse or whatever. And studies have shown that the new member states that joined the EU with the Big Bang enlargement were actually better rule followers, with a couple of exceptions, than old member states. It's not that the EU decision-making collapsed when 10, 12, 15 member states joined after the end of the Cold War. So we need to see, I mean, let's not make a big ghost, create a big ghost out of thin air.
Can I also step in? Because there's an important point. I think it's an important lesson, something that got omitted. Since 2001, the default number of commissioners no longer correspond to the number of the member states. Since 2001, meaning European leaders decided in 2001 that to be ready for the future, we should move away from a system in which each European country claims to have a representative, which, by the way, is not representative because the commissioner acts on a personal capacity and doesn't respond to the national capitals. But every single 5 years, the very same member states decided to depart from such a commitment, which is written in the treaty. I know many of you might say, this is just the law, who cares? But the law matters. These are the rules that were decided to be future-proof in 2001. Every 5 years, including in 3 weeks' time, 4 weeks' time, with the formation of the new College of Commissioners, all the member states will agree to have 27 around the table. They already decided without deciding. It's implicit. This is to say, and this is a little example, that the rules of the game are already quite future-proof, but there is no political willingness by the actual leaders to use those rules. And there are no incentives by the incoming President of the European Commission to bang and to say, those are the rules that I'm going to be enforcing. In other words, we have been assisting to a presidentialization of the European Commission in which the President of the European Commission is becoming a secretary, a de facto secretary of the will of the member states of the Union. This shift towards intergovernmentalism, as opposed to the community method, which was the idea to accept that you can be a founding member of the Union, but if you are a minority, you have to accept to be bound by decision taken by others. We are moving away from the European common interest, we are rebracing the national interest, and this is really holding us back because nobody is monitoring this particular shift away from the original model, which in reality, final point, was much more common sense based than the current one. In other words, if we had been sticking to the rules of the game, Europe would be more ready to the future, as we are discussing today, than if member states hijack the model for their own national purposes.
I'd just like to footnote that there's this paper, the Franco-German paper, on the need for enlargement and the changing of EU institutions that was commissioned by the German Minister for Europe, Anna Lohrmann, and the former French Europe Minister, Laurence Bourne, that I would like you to go back to because it offers a number of ways in which things can be changed without treaty change. And sort of course, the questionable issue of concentric circles, the core, and et cetera. But so I think that there are ways to deal with this within this new geopolitical pressure that we have. But I'd like to come to Petra now and maybe shift tack a little bit and to ask you, within this G2 world, and in specific German views after the Russian invasion, the de-risking, or what's called the de-risking from China, and the de-risking to bring it back to the home of some of us, where Chancellor Scholz comes to Serbia and says, yeah, this is lovely that you're doing this lithium mine, and Franziska Brandner behind from the Greens is negotiating all this. And there are promises maybe of a battery factory, maybe of Mercedes coming to build electric cars. How does it look from Germany for this need for Europe to change and become, or as Joschka says, how do we remain relevant in a G2 world?
Just one sentence, and I'm not an institutionalist towards this question about how to change the institutions. There has been a debate for over 20 years about the two-speed or two kind of layer Europe. It's an old debate, but it's still viable because if we take in more countries, there need to be different layers of being part of it, which I would say could have also maybe saved us from the Brexit had there been possibilities to kind of step out and still remain within. But we don't want to talk institutions now, which is always something that happens when European specialists are talking. Regarding your question, I was always a bit jealous of the US because they had this National Security Council. We still don't have it in Germany, and we definitely don't have it in Europe. So people look.
Some have been pushing for it, right?
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely important to think about national and European interests. What are they? And how then will we have to develop and change institutions to kind of defend ourselves on all kinds of issues. And when we talk about the issues that we have to defend us against, and that make it necessary to change our institutions, I would like to broaden a bit the way we look towards the future. I would say there are actually three major shifts. One is definitely the question of the security institutional setup of the world. Russia as an aggressor is something that's definitely different and will have to change the way we do politics a lot. The second thing is the growing power of the BRICS. We just heard from how African countries and government look towards Europe, and other countries look as well. We are no longer the center of the world is no longer Europe. This is an old thing, but it's also not just the G2. It's not just the US and China. It's much more complicated. There are a lot of BRIC countries who also want to have their share of power politics. So the world will become more and more kind of mingled. So how does Europe deal with this? What's our African strategy? What's our Asian strategy? In addition, we have to think about the changes that come that we will have to face because of the change of climate. We have to take this into account because it's even more than climate. It's the whole question of the man-nature problem, the question that we use too much resources, all those changes which have a lot of consequences, not least the migration issue. If the world becomes hotter and hotter, we will have more migrants from Africa, and the very rational argument that we need all these people to work for us is apparently not the one that lots of people believe in. And the more and more we have issues like the one that just happened in Solingen, a German town, where a huge tragedy happened, apparently. This is at least what they say now. A migrant has killed people, has stabbed people. This will totally influence the debate in Germany regarding migration. So the very rational thing, we are an older society that is getting older and older. We need young people. Is just not something that resonates with many people, which is wrong, but it's the way it is. So having said that, all these kind of huge shifts should make us do more often an exercise that the UNESCO called future literacy. So think about your country in, let's say, 10 years. Where do we want to be? What kind of world do we want to live in? We haven't done this for far too long. Because when we do this, we think about the ideal world. We then have, in a second step, think about the steps. How do we get there? How do we get out of these kind of mingling crises? Adam Tooze called this poly crisis. So one crisis kind of broadens the other. They all kind of mingle. How do we deal with it? I don't see any European institution now at the moment being fit to kind of do this exercise, to kind of think about the future and then think about the way how we get to the future that we want, which does not mean it's going to be the future that we're going to get, but at least we could try. So as a final sentence, I would say, either we will change within Europe, we'll change the institutions, we will change the look towards the world, we'll change our relationship with a lot of other countries, or we will be changed. And this is probably the sentence we all agree upon.
Can I ask you, before I let Vivian comment,
Can
can I ask you a seemingly simple but in fact complicated question? Is the German car industry driving a lot of the policy that Germany is leading? Because I recall,
answer, yes,
I
it
recall
is.
the Hungarian opposition leader in that election 2-3 years ago when he was in Germany, and was asked, what's the problem that you have? He said, 3 problems. And they said, what problem? Mercedes, Audi, and Volkswagen.
I think that my answer is a very short one. Yes, it always has. I did the research when I was still a correspondent in Brussels. Merkel, a call from the German automobile industry, and she changed her attitude towards European legislation, and it's still very important. And they're not very much forward-looking, because if they had been, and maybe Joschka knows it probably much better because he has been advising BMW. Look at the whole question of e-mobility. The European, we just lost out. And one of the reasons why the European automotive industry is so important, it's not just because of the jobs. It's also because of research. Most of the research that's been done in Germany within private companies is related to car industry, which is a huge problem. So I wouldn't say we are one company country, but they are very important.
Vivian, briefly.
Super quick. I think it's super interesting that mobility has such an important role within Europe. I wanted to comment a little bit on the question of migration, because it's true that we do need these migrants, but also I think that we are getting too rational with it and losing the human rights and justice perspective. We are literally contributing, from my point of view, to the death of thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of migrants. Not only at the seas, but also by outsourcing border management, and also, for example, in the desert. And I think that this is a challenge that we will confront in the future. And I like to talk a lot about this with people from the security sector in Spain. I always bring this issue is we see them as no one right now. We just see those young black males. We don't think they're important, right? So we don't see the possibility that these people that we just mistreat in our borders become businessmen. Or that they are the parents of a generation of Africans that will be leading decisions that go against those who mistreated their parents. So I think that radically changing the way we're managing migration, it's not only a question of having a space in our labor market, not only a question of human rights, which are also our rights, because we don't know if tomorrow it's us who has to migrate because a war with Russia has started and we are fleeing. And do you imagine Morocco saying, no, you're not entering now, get a vote. This can happen. It's our human rights that we are protecting too, but also this long-term strategy. The people we're mistreating today are the leaders of tomorrow. So there is more chances that by mistreating migrants and mistreating the people from the global south, we are losing power in the future.
Yeah. Bravo. Before I give the floor to Peter, I cannot not mention something that we've all seen, that this sinking of this super luxury yacht off the coast of Sicily has been in the news for the past 2 to 3 weeks. And yet, when migrants sink by the hundreds in the Mediterranean, basically it's a blip on the screen. Peter.
Yeah, following up on that note on the yachts, but from a different perspective, I would react to what Petra have raised about that the European Union, in a lot of cases, does not seem to have a good geopolitical strategic vision, which I totally agree. My optimistic note would be that in a reactionary manner, sometimes the European institutions and member states themselves can shift in the good direction. I'm just coming from Trieste, where we spent our family vacation, and from the apartment where we were living for 2 weeks, we could just see in the port one confiscated yacht of a Russian billionaire, Melnichenko, exactly. It's the biggest. It's between a yacht or a sail ship. Sorry, a sail ship, and it's really huge, and it's just it's in the. It's in the port of Trieste. Nobody uses it. It was confiscated back to 2022 as the countermeasures, as one of the first wave of countermeasures against people close to the genocidal Russian regime for a very good purpose. And I was just wondering about, could we imagine it back to 2003, when Silvio Berlusconi was having a good time with Vladimir Putin in a yacht in Russia, where they were just having a big romance. And I think not. So I think Italy, as one of the most dovish countries, traditionally towards Europe, has become one of the most important supporter, and right now under a government that has two quite strongly pro-Russian parties in the coalition. So it also become a big supporter of the sanctions towards Russia. And it gives me some hope for one important reason, that I think the future of the West, that I think is crucially important and is mutually depends on the future of Ukraine at the moment. If Ukraine can either win the war or have a good peace agreement that for the word itself rather seems as a victory and not a defeat, then I think the West will have a huge NATO and European Union as well, that are both of them are parts of the conflict, they like it or not, after many weapon transfers, after many support towards Ukraine, financial support. So if there is a good end of the war in Ukraine, then I think the West will be in a much better shape, because these are the symbolic victories that I think the West could not really show up in the last years, and that's why I think that at the moment the most important thing is the future of Ukraine and what happens in the Ukraine battlefront. So far, I think what we could see, and that's why I'm also optimistic about the future of NATO. And yeah, right now, Kamala Harris has a bit of higher, seems to be, according to polls, have a bit of higher chance of winning the presidential election, but I don't want to make predictions. I do think, though, that even if Donald Trump will win the presidential election in the United States, the NATO will not be over against a lot of doomsday predictions. And let's take a look at the example of Mike Johnson, who is one of the most fierce critics of Ukraine, and he was as the head of the Republican Party in the Congress, and he turned to be a supporter of Ukraine. He was the one who pushed the bill supporting Ukraine, Taiwan, and also Israel through the Congress against a lot of opposition from the Republican Party. Why? Because he could read the intels, and it made him change his mind. So I think MAGA Republicans in power will be not totally the same than MAGA Republicans in opposition, and I think in the first Trump presidency we could also see that. With, of course, it causing some trouble, for example, withdrawal of troops from Germany, but I don't think the NATO will be over. And on a even more optimistic note, I think if we take a look at another book on the decline of the West that Oswald Spengler wrote more than 100 years ago, between the two world wars. What was his prediction? That the liberal West, as we know, is over. That there is no chance for democratic countries to survive, and there is a new zeitgeist is coming. And 20th century proved him utterly wrong by the end. And I do believe that democracies, and we shouldn't just talk about the West, because democracies are in Eastern countries as well, South Korea, Taiwan, and you name it. So West is more like the umbrella term for more democratic countries. I think democratic countries have proved to be more adaptable to tectonic shifts in world politics than autocracies. And I do think that we have to be very careful. And I totally agree that China poses a huge threat. I think the West can more easily win the war against Russia than the war against China, which will definitely be more difficult. And I think there are a lot of challenges, but I don't think that, that right now what we can observe, a democratic decline, will definitely mean that democracies are on the losing side. And I think if we look closer on China, there are many problems there as well that we tend to forget when we talk about the future of the world.
Let me go back to Alberto, and I'd like to bring the issue that we've mentioned of climate change and the Green Deal, and of course within this context of the Russian invasion. I mean, you've all seen the news that the Houthis from Yemen managed to sink a Greek-owned oil tanker of 150,000 tons of oil. So you can imagine the ecological effect in the Red Sea of that oil being spilled. But Alberto, how do you see this equation between what we all understand, that the climate is really changing, we see it happening every day, and on the other hand, the need to create a Europe of defense?
It's, I think, the central political question for the incoming European Commission. We all remember the enthusiasm in 2019, very much boosted or supported by the climate youth movements, that somehow push Ursula von der Leyen, who rocambolesquely was cherry-picked by the head of state and government to lead the Commission, to come out with a political program that put the green agenda and decarbonization at the center, which was totally counterintuitive. That's not what the European Popular Party wanted at the time. And that big polar star, that big agenda, led the European Greens at the time to abstain on her. Fast forward, only 2 months ago, the very same Greens voted in favor of von der Leyen to actually shift away, clearly, manifestly, from that agenda, relegating it to some implementation, but also promising that, for instance, the ban on the combustion engine should actually be reopened without precedent. It never happened before. A law that has been agreed by all European leaders in the parliament will be reopened out of a political deal. In other words, there's something happening that we don't see, and that's why I'm less optimistic than Peter on this, that the enablers that Joska's remind us, the mainstream parties, not only CDU, EPP at the moment, are playing a double game. They're speaking the language of the progressive to have their vote, and this time they got the vote from the Greens, and even Volt, the most pro-European party, voted in favor of von der Leyen. Can you imagine? I currently really struggle to understand as a European how this could happen. But in reality, 6 months ago, very same Ursula von der Leyen turned her back to her own major political legacy and start basically making concessions to the farmers of Europe, who came out with a long list of claims which were largely unsubstantiated. The Green New Deal never affected agriculture. It was about to start introducing potential rules, and this was enough, this big protest, which were mainly mobilized by Copa Cogeca, meaning the big farmers of Europe, not the small, which are really affected, and all European leaders looked shocked. So the politics had to change, and it changed in a matter of one night. It changed overnight. And now the new narrative, if you look at the political priorities you were referring to of Ursula von der Leyen, you clearly see this attempt at making everybody happy. That means keeping the Green New Deal as the last, I would say, last but one chapter of those political priorities, and turning it into a brown deal in which the political industrial policy of Europe will also allow and potentially accelerate decarbonization, but through a completely different lens. So the jury is still out on which will be the political direction of this new commission. Hasn't she overpromised to too many people and too many actors? Do we really witness the emergence of a coalition agreement among the mainstream parties? I don't think so. There is no such a coalition agreement. Nothing is in writing. Nobody, certainly not the Greens, will be able to hold her accountable if in 6 months' time she will do something completely different, meaning walk away from any pending files, the 30% of the Green New Deal, which has never been discussed, it never made it to the European Parliament and the Council. So I'm deeply concerned about the predictability of that political agenda, because we are not in the nation state. We don't have these checks and balances. We cannot send her back home, but we have to wait for 5 years, right? That's what makes the distinction between the nation state and between the European Union. There's not democratic accountability in the space between two elections. There is an impeachment procedure, but it's something we have never been used. She's just been threatened at some point when Santer finally stepped back, but it really helps to understand the context. We are a bit stuck in that political dynamic.
Petra, you've written so much about all this.
Yeah, but just a quick remark. I think, like on many other issues, a lot depends upon the outcome of the elections in the US. It's like there it really is black and white. I think if Kamala Harris wins the elections, then all the questions concerning climate will become more and more a question of economic policies and then strategic trade policy. We see this already in China. And when China and the US will be heading towards making this issue an issue of their industrial strategy, Europe will have to follow suit. If not so, the world will look pretty different. But I would say there the forces won't come from the von der Leyen center, but von der Leyen will be rather be moved by what are the economic forces behind the issue.
Joschka, how do you see this as, dare I say, a veteran of green politics?
Well, I never thought that going to Alpbach in a very pessimistic mood, I would leave Alpbach even more pessimistically. It's...
We have 15 minutes to change that.
No. I mean, what should Ursula von der Leyen do? She needed a majority. And the European Green Deal will hurt our competitiveness. No, not to fulfill the Green Deal. We will be more competitive. But going back in the car industry to combustion engines, it's a very short-term strategy. It will not help. It will not make the European cars, especially the German cars, more competitive. The home market is not any longer the decisive market. The Chinese market is the key market. So, and how we are doing there is rather negative. If Harris will be elected, she will continue the policy of Biden. So they had the idea of a genius, these, how is it called?
Inflation Reduction Act.
Inflation Reduction Act. It has nothing to do with inflation and reduction of inflation. It's a growth strategy based on public debt. But it's very courageous. And then I think the European Green Deal will have a future. So we are, even in this sector of the policy of tomorrow, are dependent on the US leadership. It's what we see is a conservative majority in the European Parliament. And this conservative majority thinks that climate change is a threat, climate change is evil, but we have enough time. So no ambitions, no technological change. Where will we earn our money in the future? That's a big question, especially for the younger here in the room. Where will we earn it? Traditional technologies won't be give us a future. IT, Europe is, I wouldn't say disconnected, but almost disconnected with the two giants, US and China. Do you see any European initiative where we can put our hope on?
Take the lead, you mean?
I don't see that. So let's be realistic. The debate we had here was mostly based on the existing European Union, and it's depressing. There is no spirit of let's go into the future. That's the big problem. If you are old, if you are rich, and if you are weak, and it's in the middle of the night in a big city, it's not a good combination. Because evil persons will sense that. This is an invitation for playing games with Europe. And only the Europeans can change that, only.
No, absolutely.
And let's not fool ourselves. If Europe doesn't make it to become a power, then others will dominate us. That's the alternative.
Yeah, just say one brief sentence, just to change the mood in this room a bit. We only have 10 minutes, and I don't want to let us get out of this room in this kind of rather down mood.
But you contributed a lot to this room.
There's one of my, we didn't take the audience, but there's one of my colleagues, Thomas Meyer, in the audience.
I'll open it for questions in a
He
second.
was very optimistic because he basically said, but I don't know whether he's still here, when push comes to shove, Europe was always able to react.
Yes.
Maybe
Yes.
we could elaborate on that
No,
one.
absolutely, we'll do that. I mean, several things that came up. Peter, you want briefly?
Just a very brief note that this will be provocative, but we like it or not, but the pushback towards green policies is a result of a democratic process in the European Union. The German and the French Greens were the biggest losers of the European Parliament action and the Green Group. So we might not like it, but at least I think it reflects some kind of democratic accountability. And yeah, I think, and on the other hand, in other countries of the European Union, we did not see this huge backlash. So if we take a look at the data closely, it's mostly about the German and the French Greens. I'm not an expert of neither of the countries, so some others might know it better if it was because of some more party political issues than the green agenda itself. But the Greens were losers of this election, and I think Ursula von der Leyen, if she reacts democratically, she has to adapt to its new reality.
Yeah, and I'd like to open it to the floor, but just before that, to try and help us come to the surface again, to go back to what Joschka said at the beginning, that he doesn't believe, as I do, that there won't be a war between America and China. What people never talk about, and yet we know it, that the US, China holds, I think, 2 trillion of US debt. And that's why a certain lady called Janet Yellen, the US finance minister, goes to China every 2 months, because they have to see to it that something doesn't go wrong. I mentioned Jake Sullivan is in China now. So there'll be a lot of headlines in newspapers that China will invade Taiwan, et cetera, but I think both sides realize what it would mean. It would be basically a meltdown of the two countries and world order if that happens. Secondly, the election results in Poland, where peace lost and the quote-unquote good guys and gals won. The situation in Spain, but also let's recall the Labour Party victory in Great Britain, which is a huge reaction to what was described as the Conservative Party and the privatizations that began. They're going to roll some of these back. So it's not all doom and gloom. And the fact that, if we can state it like that, there won't be, in the near future at least, a war between the US and China, gives Europe some breathing space to put its finger to its head and say, let's see what we can do, which of course doesn't obfuscate the problem of climate, where everybody needs to participate. That's enough. I'll open the floor now. 2 questions, if there's somebody who can help with the microphone. And let me say that before we leave off for lunch, we'll do an opinion poll on whether we believe status quo or radical change. That will be the usual kind of thing will be up there. But a first question right here, and then a second one and third one over there. And we'll take all 3 at once, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Johnny Stenger, a lobbyist at Fridays for Future, and I agree to Petra Pinsler that we need EU institutions able to deal with the poly crisis, to save our future, to save the Green Deal. But how could it look like? And what do you think, especially about the Commissioner for Intergenerational Justice that von der Leyen wants to implement now? Can we implement climate justice for current and future generations in that way? And secondly, will EPP really stay loyal to all of their coalition agreements, or will they, in the end, cooperate with Meloni's ECR, even if von der Leyen promised to not do so? And finally, was it a mistake to agree on a formally kind of not binding agreement of the coalition, even though the Greens and the Social Democrats were pushing for it?
Second question right there at the end of the row.
Yeah, thank you for the amazing discussion. It was really interesting. Mr. Fischer spoke about that we don't have any vital technology in Europe. I agree to some extent, but we have ASML in the Netherlands, where I'm from. We often say now ASML is bigger than the Netherlands. And he also spoke about the Inflation Reduction Act, and I was wondering, what would a European Inflation Reduction Act look like, or what does it look like, the initiatives at the moment, to keep companies such as ASML and other potential companies of that scale in Europe and keep them efficient and competitive on the global stage?
And final question over there, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you. I'm Stefan Sindelar with European Capital of Democracy, and my question would be, whatever happened to the European dream? It was a very insightful discussion, and we all like our European way of life. But when I was a kid, everything was possible. Europe was growing, the euro was introduced, we could travel everywhere. And one of the biggest threats to democracy in Europe has not been mentioned, I believe. I was at the GMF Cities Forum in Barcelona, and the future generations, the young people, don't believe in democracy anymore. Neither in the United States of America nor here, because it doesn't deliver. And listening to this conversation, I understand. I'm starting to understand why young people don't see democracy as a value in itself anymore. And there is a contradiction in what you say, all due respect, Mr. Fischer, this fear of Europe becoming irrelevant, and then at the same time saying there is no way of reform and growth, while countries are waiting for a decade or longer, 20 years, to join the Union, make it grow, create this dynamic. This is a contradiction in itself, and I wonder, and this is my question, when will Europe start shaping its future again instead of being afraid of it?
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. I'm sorry I can't take any more, and we'll go back to the panel for a final round, and I'll start with Yanis. Take up, there were of course specific questions to Joschka and Petra, but reflect on any of those.
No, just maybe 2 sentences to finish. I was inspired by what Alberto said. Unless we change, and maybe we can go back to what Tomasi di Lampedusa said, if we want things to remain the same, which is values, rights, progressive Europe, standards of living, we need to change. We need to change everything. And Petra said, if we don't change, they will change us, right? We need to have our own values, our own ideas, and our own rules in all the things that matter and will matter in the future. And we mentioned green. It's important that we push back to the extent, and keeping cohesion, social cohesion. We have to find a way to include also our farmers in this discussion and make them understand, or also us to understand them. But also other things like we haven't mentioned enough technology. Unless Europe is in position to shape rules and shape the progress in technology in the future, I think this will impact heavily our lives, and it will be impact coming either from the market-driven forces of the US or the state-driven authoritarian forces of China. So technology is extremely important for us to play an important role, and I will stop here.
Okay. Peter.
Okay, just very brief. I mostly agree with what have just been said. I do think that so the European and also the democratic world has a bright future if it can defend its values. And I think one core value that is in danger, and that's what I think why it's good that migration have been mentioned, is the value of human life. And I think the value of the human life comes up in debates regarding Ukraine, and it become, how to say, mainstream, which is important, but we tend to forget the value of the human life when it comes to migration policies and the right-wing shift in Europe. In that respect, which I agree, that it endangers the whole mainstream, I think it's really dangerous because of that Europe can give up, and the democratic world, one of its core values.
Well, the European Union from the very beginning was always crisis-driven. And this makes me optimistic, because we are approaching a huge crisis. The world is changing. It's not only Europe. The whole world is changing. The technology will push tremendous change on all of us, on all societies. Europe will be forced to adjust to that. War is back. And then we have the crisis of the mankind, climate change, the decline of a multitude of species, the situation in the forest, the situation in the sea. All this will force us to act. And I'm not so pessimistic about the Green Deal. Whether Green Deal will exist in the present form or adjusted, it doesn't matter. The industry has made decisions. Investments have made decisions, and this will continue. And then the crises. We will be confronted with big crises, and we will have to adjust to that. So the question is the role of Europe. Are the European leaders ready to understand that? Then I'm pretty optimistic. And I think our big advantage is that the EU is a democratic creature. It's flexible enough to adjust. But this means not to exclude setbacks. Of course, we will also face setbacks. But it's especially you, the younger generation, you must engage, not only in Alpbach, in everyday politics. That's a goddamned big effort. Allow me to say that. Yeah. It's, but without engaging in democratic politics, it will be in vain. And it's up to your generation, because you will be confronted with these challenges and crises. So it's a fascinating time. It's the first time that I regret that I'm too old to be active. It's the first time, because I think it's fascinating what's going on in the world. And Europe is in the center. And we have to become a power. This is the key decision about our future. So don't be too depressed by the words of an old man.
Oh, no, on the contrary.
The future is yours, but it means it's not an easy future. You have to engage. And all your power must be put into that effort. The young Europeans are our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Joschka. I cannot resist saying what my father said, exactly the same words in 1968. When I was a student in Paris, he said, "I wish I was younger, I would go into the street now." Petra.
Yeah, I mean, and you all heard it at the end of this 3-hour-long debate. Joschka Fischer he said the word optimistic, and that we're coming out. It's getting better somehow. There's this good say of, I'm rather an optimist nor a pessimist. I'm a possibilist, which means I'm not really optimistic when I look towards the trends, but I still try. I try to find the possibilities and I work for them. And I'm not going into another pep talk now. Just a quick remark to answer your questions and the question of justice. I think as long as political parties will not be able to redefine the question of justice, they will be lost. If the Social Democrats, for example, will not be able to redefine the question of justice and what politics are needed to kind of get more justice into real life of real people, they are lost. And climate justice is an important part. Unfortunately, the young who will suffer much more, meaning you, are much less than we, the old. So the demographics are against you and against pushing for climate politics. But we all have children and grandchildren, and this might help. Actually, as I said, I just wrote a whole book about this issue, how we can get progress back into the debate and how this can be pushed forward to 6:30. We can further discuss this issue. Thank you.
Great, and as you know, Petra has her book promotion launch.
Actually, I think I need to say the title in German. In German is
Yes, please.
Ist das Kunst oder there is a say which says Ist das Kunst oder kann das weg? So we kind of redefined it saying Ist das Zukunft oder kann das weg?
Okay. So
Actually dealing with the question how we kind of change our attitude towards future and how political parties should do so.
more on that at 6:30 tonight.
You.
Vivian.
Briefly, yes, the world is changing at a fast pace, and I must say that I'm excited about it. I know like there might be a lot of challenges, and this is, I think I agree with you that really tough times are coming. I'm just afraid that we use old strategies or all the old strategies for new scenarios that are coming. So I think that like in this process, Europe should be very aware of the role, not the role that wants to have in the future, because we're not gonna decide the role we have in the world. Like it's the world that is gonna be shaping itself and we will have to reaccommodate to it. I think that we should be thinking of the role that we've had in building today's world, to make peace on those things that we didn't perform well, and to start thinking the new strategies, the new tactics, and the new ways, getting the best of what we've learned already, but trying to envision new ways, because I feel that as we are the ones that are gonna lose, or it seems that like we are the ones losing in this new chapter that the world is opening, we need to be really strategic, so not to fall back. Yeah.
Thank you, Ivan. Yeah, I think we all sense that over the past few decades, European integration occur more as driven by events than by choices, besides the regional choice to actually set it up, those communities, which was not an obvious choice. But today, I think we can no longer content ourselves, at least me as a European, I refuse to accept this very minimalist understanding of Europe, in which things happen because they were dictated by events, natural disaster, war, external conditions, material conditions deteriorating. No, Europe can and should be more than a negative agenda. And now I only see negative agendas in the European political party. It's about countering, it's about patchwork, it's about adapting. No, we need to envision a positive agenda. And that positive agenda is really about reclaiming that power that each of us has to be part of a political conversation. Only the political process can enable the creation of ideas, models that then have to fuel and feed and be appropriated by many more people. And I don't see that political space emerging because we are witnessing 27 parallel national conversations inhabited by 27 political classes who are basically talking among themselves about Europe. And the media cannot cover all of this in one way, but there are 27 depictions of what is happening around Europe, and that's also what emerged today. So please join me and join many millions of people for whom Europe has been the most defining experience in their life. We are millions. Some of us are aware of it because we were mobile, we were lucky, Erasmus Plus and so forth. But there are many more millions, and those millions are blue-collar workers. They found better conditions in other European countries. They are not white-collar workers. There are people who work in hospitals, they work in nursery, there are seasonal workers, millions, but they are not visible. This European community of real people is not self-aware. Those people don't know each other. We live in parallel life. But if these people are mobilized, they could really become the generator of this positive agenda we lack today. So my invitation to you today is to join that positive agenda, to shape it, to gain a voice in any possible way you can find, through politics, through participation, for a variety of ways. But today we have no excuse but just making this happen.
Thank you. And now we have the polling. Peter? Okay, use your high technology, which we can't do because we're underneath it. And vote. It takes 2 minutes. And while you're voting, I'll say a few words without any pretense to any conclusions, but a few thoughts that I think we all share. First of all, and what Joschka and others were saying, I mean, all these migrants are going where? They're going to Europe, the United States, and if they can reach Australia. No one's going to China. No one's going to Russia.
Be careful.
Oh, come on, Joschka.
There is a migration to China from Southeast Asia.
There is, but I mean, when we think of Africa, of the Middle East, they're principally here. Yeah, but I agree with that. There's jobs in China, but I think those who are coming here are for reasons that we said, that there is freedom, it's not perfect, that you can speak your mind, there's some level of social security, and there is an outlook that this will remain. So the fact that what I think we've all been saying in a certain sense, we believe in Europe the way it is, but we need to be more engaged. Nothing happens if you don't engage yourself in this fight. All of our freedoms in Europe and the Western world were conquered through institutions or mainly in the street. The democratic revolutions of France, of Britain, of the Netherlands, of the United States were all conquered against those who tried to repress freedom. And those hard-gained liberties that we have are only be remaining if we defend them and if we stand up for them. So, do we have the results? Yes, okay, so has radical change occurred in the European political landscape due to the elections in the past 1 year? 47% say radical change has occurred, 53% status quo has prevailed. We are sort of within the margin of error here, so I would say it's a 50-50. So It's all about democracy, and with all of its faults and shortcomings, we need to defend it. But please, join me in thanking all of our speakers, and thank you for being with us.